I'm ready. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, and everyone who's there and is gathered together for this great conference to talk about one of the most important things I think is happening in the world, which is the renewal of our educational inheritance. Certainly the educational inheritance of the Christian church, but really largely of Western civilization. Um, what we're seeking to recover and renew will be a blessing not only to the church but to our wider culture. And it's something that our ancestors really gathered, refined, thought a lot about, tried to make it as good as they could and pass it down to us. And about 100 years ago, we almost lost this tradition, but we've kept it and we're recovering it. It really, in many ways, has continued, even if it has diffused. And so we're pulling the strands together. I like to say that in some ways we're building a bridge back to this tradition. The Maybe we never really lost a bridge, but the bridge when I got on it, and maybe when I was trying to construct it, some 25 years ago, was like a swinging rope bridge. It was, well, a little dangerous if you were following me on that bridge, and you needed to go single file along the way. But the next generation has come along and has built that bridge out of strong wood and widened it. It's more stable and more people can cross it. We know a little bit more about what we're doing. But we engage this tradition with a great humility because we didn't make it. We simply receive it and try to redeploy it and give it again to our children and to the wider community or culture that we're in. Anyone who encounters this lovely tradition is humbled by it because it's deep, it's wide, it's long, it's beautiful, and it's more than any one man or woman can master in a lifetime by far. By analogy, it's kind of like going into one of the great world museums, like the British Museum in London or the New York Metropolitan Museum. And I'm sure you have some great museums in Australia. If you go into the Metropolitan Museum of New York, you don't go through that in a day and then say something like this: I got the Met. Ask me any question. I'll tell you what's in there. You come out feeling astonished, small, maybe inspired, but also ignorant. It's something like that's what's happened. What happens when you encounter this tradition. I'm just so glad that we have encountered it and we're bringing it back, and that it is transforming us slowly as we become familiar with it once again. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing there in Australia. I think you're the only country that's a continent, and the continent of your country needs this tradition just like every culture does, every human being does. And having talked with Sarah and Con and others who are a part of the renewal in Australia, I'm just so grateful. So grateful for you, what you're doing. And thank you for the time that you're giving me this morning, and the time that you're going to give to my two very good friends and colleagues, Jolie Hodge and Brian Williams. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm so glad to be with you this way. What I want to speak to you about this evening here in the Harrisburg area of Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful evening. I can see the sun setting while it's rising where you are. And I want to talk to you about the principles of good teaching. I want to talk to you about what it means to be a good teacher. And to do that, I've prepared some slides and I'll share them with you. So let me do that, and I hope to leave some time for some questions at the end of this presentation. I should also say that Jolie Hodge and Brian Williams are well equipped to answer some of the questions that might be prompted by my presentation, and so I hope that they will participate in the Q&A, not just after this session, but throughout the conference. So let me share. So I wanted to talk to you about principles of being a good teacher. And it's important when we think about being a good teacher to think about what well, makes for a good teacher? And sometimes when we ask that question, people come back to mind. We start thinking about teachers we've had in the past. And as you're sitting there, can you recall a few teachers that you've had in your past who have blessed you and been transformative to you in some fashion? I'm sure you can. I'm sure you've had some teachers that weren't that good, but I bet there were a few that you would say were truly a good teacher. And I bet if you think about your high school career and your college career, there were times when you made recommendations to others. He's a good teacher. She's a good teacher. How did you like that class? He's a good teacher. Well, what is it that makes for a good teacher? Steve Martin has this comedy class on masterclass.com. And at the beginning of this class, where he's actually being filmed teaching and instructing some up and coming young comedians, he says, if you want to be a comedian, be good. Be good. And he goes on to say that it's not actually that easy to be good at 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 being a comedian. And he goes on to share how he spent a good while working and training and refining his own craft. That's not a surprise. Anyone who's really accomplished at an art has practiced it, even if they've been given natural talent. And somebody who is extraordinarily good at an art can even conceal their art. For example, if you watch a really good stand-up comedian, you'll get the impression that they're just making up things while they're standing on the stage telling stories, but everything's been carefully rehearsed such that you forget that they've practiced, and it just seems so natural. The same thing is true of great athletes. By having been so well practiced, they seem to just be, natural. And in any given moment, they know what to do and what to do quickly and how to work with others. So art sometimes conceals art. When I think about being a good teacher, I think about it in two ways. And that's what Carrie Eben and I have tried to do in the book that we wrote, this one here, Good Teacher, How to Be a Good Teacher. We subtitled it 10 Key Pedagogical Principles That Will Transform Your Teaching. We need to be good in at least two senses. First of all, we hear Christ addressing this problem, this issue at one point. It's in Mark 10 when a rich man comes up to him and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Christ's response is to say, if you recall, "Why do you call me good? Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." And without going into the theology of this passage, which I think is interesting, Christ is called a good teacher. And many writers have said over the centuries that Jesus, in fact, is the great teacher, the good teacher in our midst. If we're to learn anything, well, thank God we have been able to see some aspect of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the holy as a human being made in God's image and likeness. It's a tremendous benefit and delight. It's a privilege to be able to live in this cosmos and to see with our own eyes something of the goodness of God, such that we can say the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and every language hears that speech as it goes forth. Psalm 19. The good teacher. What does it mean to be a good teacher? I remember when I was a young head of school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and a group of leaders on the faculty came together, and we thought, we want our school to be great. And several of us had read that book by Jim Collins, this business book called Good to Great. And we wanted to be a great school. So we started a project, and we called it Good to Great at Covenant Christian Academy. And we started to do some research and assessment of our programs, our pedagogy, our curriculum, et cetera. And after a while, we realized that we had misnamed this project because we weren't even good yet. uh, we we were talking about being a great school. We were 2 or 3 years in. We weren't even a good school, and so we renamed our project from mediocre to good. So it might be sufficient to just become a good teacher and not be so concerned about being a great teacher. What if you could be a good teacher? And then maybe sometime years later, someone else might dare to call you great, and hopefully you wouldn't hear it if it were said. Let another man's lips praise you and not your own. When Carrie and I wrote this book and we thought about what to title it, we had a discussion about this, and we decided to go with good and not great for the reasons I just mentioned. But we decided to go with good as well because teachers need to be good in at least two senses. First, they need to be good people, good souls, good human beings. We know that a lot of what happens in education is imitation. We know this from Luke chapter 6 when Jesus says, when a student has been fully trained, he will be like his teacher. If this is true and we take it seriously, it applies to us as adults. In other words, we've been fully trained. And if we've been fully trained, well, what follows? We've become like our teachers. And we've become like our teachers even in ways we're not conscious of. In the same way we parent like we were parented, we will teach the way we were taught. We absorb pedagogy and the art of teaching, the life of teaching, schooling, education. We absorb it over 13 years of being in a school or more if we've gone off to college, and we've been formed because education always forms. It's always formative. So you become like your parents. You become like your teachers. And that's why it's important, I think, that you've had at least some good teachers that you can imitate now in ways that would be edifying and helpful. So a good teacher is a good person. And, think about this. Maybe you've been asked this question before. What did your pastor preach on 2 or 3 weeks ago? Can you remember? It's often hard to remember, positive content that's delivered to us, especially in a lecture form, like this form right now. After 2 or 3 weeks, it tends to fade. So if I were to ask you, what has your pastor preached on a few weeks ago? It might be hard to answer that question. But if I asked you, what do you admire about your pastor and what does he embody? What have you learned from him? I bet you'd be much more easily able to answer that question because the teacher, the pastor, is a person who models for you a life of virtue and holiness and goodness, such that forms and that teaches and that cultivates more than academic content. So when a student's been fully trained, you'll be like his teacher. Therefore, it would be very helpful if your teacher was simply a virtuous, holy, good person. So this becomes an important principle, doesn't it? Maybe it's the principle of principles. We have to be holy people. We have to be virtuous people. We have to be growing ourselves to be a reservoir, as it were, that's always receiving fresh water so that we have water to give. We can't stagnate. We have to be models of what it means to even be a learner. In fact, I think there's a sense in which this is profoundly true, that a teacher is simply a more mature student. And the teacher models inquiry, curiosity, holy curiosity, contemplation, eagerness, and learning. In other words, the various virtues that make a person thrive and flourish in any vocation should characterize to a significant degree the model who we call a teacher. In Latin, the word studium means eagerness or zeal or fondness for something. And yes, it is the root for our English word study and student. To be a student means to be zealous for the true, the good, the beautiful. And so if you as a teacher don't love the art that you're teaching, don't show zeal and eagerness and fondness for that which you're teaching, whether it's geometry, history, biology, or Latin, how would you expect that your student would love that subject or art, himself or herself? We have to be good. And that can sound kind of self-righteous, like we got to work at being good. But in the right context, it's profoundly true. Are you a good student, even though you might be 35 or 45 or 55? And do you model that in front of your students such that your own zeal radiates from you, and much of the subject material is caught, not just taught, because it lives in you, because Latin lives in you, because history, literature live in you, whatever the art is, whatever the science, because it lives in you and because you continue to be a student of it. So perhaps a teacher is just a more mature, older student. And perhaps a student is just an immature teacher. Because when you come to discover something that's truly beautiful or good, you want to talk about it with other people, do you not? And we do this with coffee, a good cup of coffee. You found the best coffee shop in Brisbane, you start telling it to your friends. I often use the illustration of the stick bug, which we have stick bugs. I know you have some remarkable creatures in Australia that we don't have here in North America. Just mention the kangaroo. However, in central Pennsylvania, we have a stick bug. I don't know if you have those in Australia, but these are sticks that happen to be bugs. You can't tell the end from the head. They're remarkable. They look just like sticks and they move. And when you see one for the first time, and especially if you're 7 years old, you will tell your friends about it. So perhaps a student loves something and wants to teach it as they come to know something true, good, or beautiful. They're going to want to share it. We study what we love. So a good teacher must be good in this sense that a good teacher models virtues, models being a student. But naturally, there's a second sense in which a teacher should be good. A teacher should be skilled at teaching, should have acquired some degree of expertise in the craft of teaching. In other words, pedagogy. And pedagogy is just a rich word, just like student is. Pedagogy, because its roots are Greek, paidion is their child, and paidion in Greek for the word child, and then again, the verb which means to lead. So there's, just etymologically, it makes us think that we're supposed to be leading a child, taking a child somewhere. Yes, this used to apply to the Greek slaves that the Romans employed, and those pedagogues would take the Roman aristocratic children to their classes. But it also has this other connotation of leading a child to come to know something true, good, or beautiful. So teaching methodology, pedagogy, leading a child. There's also a word called psychagogy, which means to lead a soul. And so there's a sense in which a good Christian teacher is not just leading a student to know a skill, an art, a discipline, a subject, but is leading the soul to be conformed to and in harmony with the beautiful cosmos and the truths in it that we discover as we study together. So I often say, and Jolie and Brian can can give you their own stories about this, but that we could recover classical education simply by doing etymological study, just by looking at the typical words we use and looking at the history of how they were used. We will uncover this archive of this treasury of learning that is in what we call the classical tradition, the liberal tradition, liberal education, the education of the church. So we look at the word study. We think of zeal and eagerness, hunger, fondness for something. We look at a word like pedagogy, and we think we need to lead students to see things, take them somewhere. This metaphor is even present in Luke 6, where we read that when a student is fully trained, he will be like his teacher. The verse before says, right before it's a couplet. It's in parallel. This verse in front of it says, if a blind man leads a blind man, won't they both fall into a pit? But the student, when he's fully trained, he'll be like his teacher. And so what we learn here is that a teacher is the opposite of a blind man. That means a teacher is sighted. But just as a blind man ought not to lead a blind man, a sighted person who sees well and has seen beautiful things ought to lead others to see those same beautiful things. There's a leadership that's involved. The teacher essentially says, follow me, like follow the leader. The teacher essentially says to his or her students, I have seen something remarkable, and I want you to see it with your own eyes. Follow me. That's just, I think, a master principle of teaching. This means that you can't see for your students. You can't see for them. And by illustration, if you would happen to see a stick bug for the first time and were astonished by it, what should you do to help your students come to know the stick bug? Well, in modern education, you'd take some pictures of it and you'd show it in a PowerPoint, and you would tell them how marvelous the stick bug is. And you would give them photographs of it. Maybe you would bring in a stick bug, which would of course be the best thing to do, actually bring in a living stick bug, or bring them to the stick bug. But usually what we'll do is we'll tell everybody before it happens, tomorrow I'm going to be bringing in a stick bug and you're going to love it. You won't believe it. Its head is like the tail. Its tail is like the head. It's a stick that's a bug. It's a bug that's a stick. And then you bring it in and show them. But you've taken away the most wonderful element of poetic engagement, participatory engagement, and surprise. You haven't let them see it with their own eyes. You haven't said, let me take you somewhere and let me show it to you. When you do that, when you are the person who has seen marvelous sights and can bring others to see it, do you know what you become in the eyes of your students? You become a muse. And there's another important, deeply important, profoundly important word that is one of maybe 15 words we could use as a synonym for teacher. We have instructor, we have guide, we have educator, we have mentor. These are all good words, but we also have muse. And the Greek word muse, as you know, means one that inspires learning. And you might know the mythology of the 9 muses that are all the daughters of memory. There was one for dancing, there was one for singing, there was one for history, there was one for poetry, there was one for astronomy. So if you're a muse, you are bringing a kind of musical education, a kind of musing to your students, a kind of inspiration to them, such that the entire world is perceived as a kind of cosmic living museum, something beautiful and enchanted. And it's particularly teachers in lower school play the role of the muse, because they are the ones acquainting students for the first time with the stick bug and so many other treasures that they will encounter for the first time under the leadership of the Muse. This is education in wonder. And wonder is one of the principles, transformative principles, that we cover in the good teacher, and this comes to us in the tradition. And so, by the way, all of the principles in the book are just well-known principles that have been talked about for centuries in the tradition of Christian and classical education. And Carrie and I did not discover them. In fact, the list that we came up with did not fall from heaven, and it's not the only way to sequence these particular principles. But we tried to gather them the best we could, and someone else, I'm sure, will improve on it. So there were 10 of them, and wonder and curiosity is one key one, and I've already really been talking about it. But before I share with you a few more principles, let me just talk about what a principle is and why a good teacher in the classical tradition needs to be a principled teacher. Why? Because principles are first things. These are the things we have to get right from the beginning. To begin well is to end well. And if we don't know what our principles are, we will waste our effort and time. There is an order and a sequence to most learning that's important to follow. And there's an order to human nature, and therefore education we should teach according to the nature of the human beings in front of us. And as we learn about human nature, we learn about how to teach human beings. And over the years, a lot of wise human beings have said, these are principles you should pay attention to if you want to teach well. If you want to be able to deploy great techniques in the classroom, well, you need to be principled first, because a principle will enable you to know what technique to use in any given circumstance. You'll become prudent and wise, know what to do when you find yourself in one circumstance or another. Of course, experience is a great teacher in this regard. Think about this in some other disciplines like carpentry. We use this illustration in the book. Carpenters are principled. If they're good, they're principled. Otherwise, if you don't know the principles of carpentry, guess what? You can't make decisions on your own. You need to continually ask somebody else what to do. Should I use a framing hammer or this ball-peen hammer? Should I use the 2-inch nail or the 1-inch nail? Or should I just use a drill here? Should I use a 2x4 or should this be a 1x6? Excuse me, sir, could you please help me? Should I use a saw here? Should I use a power saw? Should I use a hacksaw? What saw should I use? Well, this person doesn't understand the principles of building, at least not yet. And everyone has to start that way. But we start with principles. And let me just state some principles that carpenters know, and you probably know these. Here's one that we've all learned because it is a principle that applies universally to human beings. The carpenters usually put it this way: measure twice, cut once. And you ignore this principle at your peril. You'll be making more trips to the lumber store if you don't abide by this principle. Measure twice, cut once. And here's something else that's just worth noting. The principles that we've gathered in this book, these pedagogical principles, they are not just pedagogical principles. They happen to be cosmic or human principles that apply to everything, and therefore they apply to teaching. Here's another principle the carpenters heed. Don't begin with the roof. Well, that's so obvious because of the order of the cosmos that it doesn't even need to be stated. The gravity kind of requires that we don't start with the roof. We start with the foundation and we build up. But it's a principle, and you ignore it at your peril. You won't be doing too well as a carpenter if you ignore that principle. And there are others. Well, when it comes to teaching and pedagogy, there are some that are tried and true. And one of them is that we need to evoke and model wonder. So I've mentioned that one, but let me mention, there's 10, and I'm not going to get through all 10 of them. I would be violating a principle of pedagogy if I tried to teach you 10 principles today. Because there's a principle that says multum non multa. It's better to teach a few things deeply than to try to do a superficial coverage of a lot of things because of human nature and the way we're made. If I said to you, I'm so glad that you're here for this conference, I want to share with you just 18 principles on pedagogy. And I'm going to go through all 18 today. I'm really hopeful hopefully these will be helpful to you. As soon as you hear the word 18, you're thinking, my goodness, do I have to track 18 principles? Because Aristotle discovered this, 2,500 years ago. He says in his book on rhetoric that if you have to give a speech, how many points should you have? How many points should you? He says 3. And then he says, if you're only going to make 3 points, what should be your best point? And he says, your best point, well, what do you think? You've got 3 points to make. Where do you put your best point? Not in the middle. You might think at the end. Well, he says that's second best, but first best is your opening. You make your best point right out of the gate. And then your weakest point in the middle and your second best point at the end. It just turns out that cognitive science happens to verify this. You can read about this in Daniel Willingham's book, Why Students Don't Like School. He's a cognitive scientist that works at UVA. The memory studies and the attention studies that cognitive scientists have done prove or confirm what Aristotle said so many years ago. So multum non multa is a principle that says it's better to teach a few things deeply and well so that you can linger, ponder, swim in these things for a while. That will aid memory. It will create attention and delight. But if you try to avoid multum non multa and cover a lot of stuff, which we are always tempted to do, it's not well learned. It's not as delightful, and it's not as permanent. But we do this all the time. We go for the multa, and teachers who love their art do it regularly. Why? Because they love their art and they want to teach more of what they love. And they forget what it's like to be a beginner. So there in the room, Dr. Brian Williams is sitting, and he knows this story. There was a teacher that worked with him at the Templeton Honors College named Dr. Fred Putnam, retired recently. He's a Hebrew scholar. He knows the Hebrew Bible really well. And he said at one point, I am no longer the right person to teach Hebrew to my students. Why would he say that? Why do you think? Why would somebody who knows Hebrew about as well as a human can say, I ought not to teach Hebrew to freshmen? In fact, he said, my graduate students are the ones who should be teaching Hebrew to first-year Hebrew students. Why? Because he knows it so well that he's forgotten what it's like to learn it. And he's wise enough to know that. But the graduate students who are still close enough to having just learned it are much better at teaching first-year students. And he would be tempted to cover too much, and he forgets that it takes a slower process than maybe he would imagine to actually learn Hebrew. And this is true of any art. So I'm just teasing out some of the benefits of heeding this principle, multum non multa. And I'll give you 2 more that come from the Latin, and then we'll have to wrap up because of time and wanting to get some questions in. Festina lente is a principle that comes down to us also in Latin, and it means make haste. Festina means make haste, and lente means slowly. Well, it seems kind of paradoxical. How can you actually go faster by going slower? And you've heard, this phrase, less is more, and so on. But there are times in life in which you actually do go faster by slowing down, especially if you are thinking of the long term and not just the short episode that's right before you. This is a principle that applies not just in pedagogy, but it applies in military warfare. It applies across the board in human experience. It's better to master every step in a sequence than to bound ahead in order to try to get there faster. You can think about the old story of the tortoise and the hare who just bounds forward in the race, and the tortoise who plods along and slow and steady wins the race. Well, that's a little children's story to help you get to think about this. Think about it in terms of preparing for war. The Roman army held very deeply and profoundly to festina lente. It was a maxim not just for educators, but for generals. So the Roman generals would practice the Roman soldiers, their formations, their attack formations, their defense formations. They would practice marching. They would practice combat. They did this to the point of tedium. They would repeat it such that they became very fast in battle, such that when it was time to march, they could get to their enemy very quickly. And so by preparing slowly and even tediously, they would defeat their enemies with lightning speed very quickly. Festina lente. In fact, the name of the Roman army was exercitum, which means a bunch of guys who are constantly exercising. So by regular exercising, seemingly not doing anything, not making much progress, they would win very, very fast. And so this is the way you make progress academically as well. If you speed ahead and accelerate beyond the required mastery of the various segments and steps in an order of learning, you will spoil the work and you'll end up foundering, while the people who have behind you been mastering each step will pass you by. I've seen this happen in mathematics, where the kids who are quick studies in math and get promoted and advance to the next study, they're doing algebra, when they're 10, etc. They get passed by in high school by the students who have mastered each step, and they remember how to do everything and have a deeper understanding of mathematics. And lastly, I'll just mention repetitio mater memoriae. This is a sister concept, and in Latin it means repetition is the mother of memory. And some of us, especially because of our progressive influence, when we hear that, we think, oh, drill and kill. Repetition does not sound that exciting. And we've lost the original meaning of repetitio. Because again, just going to the Latin, repetitio means to seek again. Petitio, to ask, to seek. Think of a petition or petitionary prayer. It's a request. It's a seeking after something. And repetitio means I'm going to seek that thing again, the same way you do when you go to your favorite restaurant every year for your anniversary, or you read that poem you love again, or you listen to that song over and over again out of delight, or you go back to certain pictures and images, photographs, and look at things that delight you again, and you begin to have a more deeper appreciation, and you begin to see things that you haven't seen before when you come back again for a repetitio, for a review. So reviewing isn't doing the same thing the same way at the same time. It can involve a lot of variety and different perspectives. Don't you have a vacation spot that you like to go back to? And you may do some of the same things, but you see things differently. You grow. You can't get to know a town in just one visit. And so by repetition, by going back, you're seeking something good again because you want it to be permanent. And children seem to know this intuitively. They know that if they're going to really understand how something works in nature, like it could be the water cycle, or how it could be how insects reproduce. These things are marvelous. They want to keep coming back to them, seeing them again until they become permanent. And if it's something good that you're bringing into view, or into hearing or into taste, shouldn't your students want to linger over it? Shouldn't they want to come back to it again? And shouldn't you be able, when you review, to show them yet another perspective or aspect of something true, good, and beautiful that warrants a second look? This is what the word respect means. In Latin, it just means to look again. If you respect someone, you give them a second look. So there's so many beautiful things in the cosmos, so many beautiful things in the tradition of learning that's come down to us that warrant more than a first look. Okay, so if you heed these principles, and these principles become the first things in your pedagogical life, it will keep you from becoming an educational technician, because the educational technician is the person who only can think of techniques and doesn't know exactly when to use a particular technique, isn't liberated, and doesn't have the prudence to know what to do and when, because they're following a script and they haven't thought in terms of principles. So by starting with the first things, the second things will follow in place and find their rightful order and place. Those second things will be techniques, particular things that you do in a classroom or in any educational setting. So education is largely principial, and why we do need to know what techniques are and learn techniques, like what hammer do I use? What nail do I use? Do I use a drill here? Pedagogically speaking, what do I do? The principles will set us free to make much better decisions regarding what techniques to use. And I'll conclude here by simply saying again that education is the cultivation of human beings to flourish, grow, and to do what only human beings can do, to do it to the best of their capacities, to be the best versions of themselves, to be virtuous, to achieve excellence in all of the dimensions of our humanity, so that we would know and love the true, the good, the beautiful, and the holy, and be prepared for any good work, any vocation. That's education, and it is a first thing. It comes before that second thing, which we call vocation or a job. Jobs are important. They're very important. We all want good jobs for our kids, etc. But they're not the first thing. The first thing is a cultivated human education that helps us to grow in virtue. All of the virtues, the academic virtues, the civic virtues, the theological virtues, the cardinal virtues. And this happens best when we have before us a model of those virtues. A teacher who is good because they embody those virtues, and good because they are skilled at imparting them in other various ways pedagogically. So I hope that's of some help to you. And we'll turn it over to you, Sarah, for what's next.